Hi, Misha here, and I've been thinking about what rifles to cover next. I've kind of been in a pistol mood lately, and I was already kind of half musing about these. After all, last year I covered the Finnish M39s, and this year looked at the L35s again. And then the Mosin crate posted some M2830 rifles, chambered for 7.62 by 53 as the Finns call it, but we would call it 7.62 by 54R. There are minor differences, but they're interchangeable. And I thought, yeah, this seems like a good time to revisit both Finland's M28 and M2830. These were used by the Civil Guard, the SKY or SY, different places abbreviate, and served during the Winter and Continuation Wars, and some ended up in the hands of the Army, the Finnish Defense Forces, after the wars when the Civil Guard were disbanded. There's a lot of interesting things here, and it really gets into how to make the Mosin the best it could possibly be. And there are some major differences between the M28 and M2830, as well as, of course, with the older M27 used by the Army and the later M39 used by both the Army and the Civil Guard. So, yeah, it's been a while since we've hung out and talked about these. And so let's begin with the original. And to help us compare, bringing out the Finn M91. This is not a whole lot more than a Russian 1891 Mosin that was reworked by the Finns. And there are several minor variations. These were used both by the Civil Guard and the Army. Some would have standard sling swivels, some have these wire types, and different barrels would be used. Essentially, they were reworked and refurbished and rebarreled, sometimes, Russian guns. And there would be a derivative used by the Civil Guard known as the M9124. I had one in the past, sold it because, frankly, needed to sell something, and the differences were quite minor. But that was kind of the first effort. The M28 here would be our second. In 1927, towards the end of the year, the Finnish Civil Guard would order 10,050 barrels from SIG over in Switzerland. And it would not take them very long to make the barrels. They would take delivery in relatively early 1928, and I guess the Civil Guard were happy because they would order 10,050 more. And after this, they would order 11,500 from Tikka in Finland. So that's kind of the basis for our new rifle. We have brand new barrels, and that would seem to be what's at the heart of a lot of Finnish Mosins, a new barrel, because the receivers would be reused and reworked Russian. In fact, Finland never made receivers. They used Russian. And a lot of times they would be either World War I era Russian makes or even Remington and Westinghouse, just whatever they could get, mostly before 1917, 1918. Now in the 1920s, they would trade for some Mosins with other European nations, but the bulk of what they had was World War I era. So they start off with new barrels, and they go to a new length. This would be one of the early Mosin short rifles. They get about 5 inches off of this gun. It's about 46.5 inches. See, they had looked at the Army's M27, which was a similar length, but they thought they could do a better job. And as it turns out, they were correct. They used essentially the same type of protected front sight with ears, but they went to their own type of end cap, and they went to their own style of forearm, being spliced sometimes using original stocks and what have you. They would smooth out and add a secondary spring somewhat to the bolt, but mechanically the differences are quite minor and just there to have better feeding. So this one still has the sling slots, and they would use essentially the same type of rear sight, just modified a bit. So the big difference was really the front sight. We have a new blade, and it should be noted that on the M28 it is adjustable, but it does require a special tool, whereas on this, of course, it's an unprotected blade. We also have a new type of bayonet lug here for more of a blade type versus the SAKO type, and of course we have a shorter cleaning rod, all that good stuff. So the idea is to just have better sights and to have a better barrel, brand new barrels, to squeeze some accuracy out. And here we are flipped over. The Civil Guard would get their first M28s, as they were now known, in spring and summer of 1928. And while the barrels were from other sources, assembly, as well as some small parts manufacturing and refurbishment, would be done at SAKO. And the bulk of production would be from that time until about 1932. There would be a total of 6 runs, 4 major, 2 minor. And the final ones actually would not be done until 1934, even 1935, kind of using up existing parts. Also in 1932, SAKO would try its hand at manufacturing barrels, building about 1,400 for the M28 project, meaning they no longer had to rely on Tikka barrels or barrels from a foreign supplier like SIG. In the end, they would produce 33,016 M28s, and they would be issued throughout the Civil Guard, and they would actually be quite good, especially as the M27 started really experiencing problems in the mid-30s. They were really kind of glad they went this route. However, you know, this is still a standard Mosin rear sight. And a lot of the other features are pretty standard too. And we do need that special tool for the front sight. By the way, these ended up with the nickname dog ears, which continued throughout because of the kind of floppy type ears. Essentially, they knew they could do better, so in 1930 they set out to do just that at SAKO. The first priority was that rear sight. SAKO tinkered with it, and in 1932 there was a prototype concept sight called the Model 32 that was a new ladder type. It was solid. You couldn't flip it up and shoot through it, so you just, adjustable ramp from 100 to 1,000 meters, and this would lead directly to this style, the flat style, the following year, 1933, that did end up with the cutout. And it was kept in the white and given the markings, they were blued to make it kind of high visibility. And testing went well. They certainly preferred it over the old kind of remarked from Martians to meters Russian sights. So next they went to working on the front sight to go with. Initially they used the same front sight, but then in 1933 they went to a version that could actually be adjusted for windage using a typical screwdriver, which I think you can understand why that's important. So these were the first 2 changes. They were trialed in the spring of 1933. They produced better accuracy, And so SAKO would do a limited run of about 2,700 of these early variants, call them transitional M28s maybe. From there, they would continue to improve the design. For example, they would add a secondary spring to the trigger, trying to further improve it. They would also give dimples at the rear of the mag well. They're actually under the wood line here. It'd be very hard for me to try to show you. This was to try to help prevent rim lock and just make feeding better. Kind of cool. So those would have some potential. They even thought about getting rid of the kind of clunky Mosin safety and did experiment with kind of various Mauser-inspired safeties for the bolt. But in the end, that was a bridge too far. I think they were learning from the Army's experiences with the wings on the M27. The idea, they wanted to improve the guns, but they still needed to be more or less compatible with other guns. So from there, they would have another round of trials. I should mention that they did also slightly alter this end cap. The original style here is a two-piece. There's a recessed front end where the cleaning rod goes. For the newer pattern, they made it a single piece. And they also changed the way that the cleaning rod mounted inside to make it a little more secure. So yeah, 1934, they had another round of trials. And this is when it was accepted as the M2430 since the project began in 1930. This is also when the M28s would kind of get wrapped up. Now, at this point, the Army's M27s are having problems with shattering forearms and other issues. The M28s and M2830s didn't really seem to have that problem. It's attributed to the different front end, but they did add a reinforcing pin right here as an easy solution. Later, they would also, when it was time to replace handguards, go to a thicker, lower, and they would also introduce a new upper handguard to work with the new pattern of rear sight. Interestingly, while SAKO actually would make most of the components and modify most of the components in-house, these upper handguards were actually outsourced. They're one of the few things they weren't doing by 1934-35. And eventually, around 1936-37, some guns would get new-made rear sections here that were a little bit thicker and stouter than the original Mosin parts. Again, these are being built and rebuilt from existing parts, so there are no hard and fast rules. And finally, in 1937, the Finnish shooting team was going for the world competitions, and they had a choice between the Army's M27 and the new, at the time, M2830, and not surprisingly, they picked the M2830, and they actually won. So that gave the rifle and the Civil Guard a good bit of prestige through competition. Unfortunately, it would not be long before its fame would come because of warfare. The Finnish Civil Guard operated as frontline and sometimes attack troops during the 1939-1940 Winter War, roughly 3.5 months, 100 some odd days. And of course, I have to mention that the sniper Simo Häyhä used an M2830 during that war to great effect. Häyhä was one of the best snipers, and he did it with, frankly, one of the best non-custom built military rifles, due in great part to a good barrel and very easy to use and adjustable sights. And they were just durable. They earned a reputation for accuracy and dependability, especially in the cold, good feeding. they really were the pinnacle of the Mosin in a lot of ways, and aspects from the M2830 would be translated directly over into the M39, which was supposed to come online in 1939, but would be delayed, so M2830 production would continue. In fact, while they were building, 2,000 to 3,000 a year on average since the mid-30s, 1940 would be the largest production year with 4,000 built. However, by 1941, SAKO would build the last of these. It's possible a few more were assembled from parts or rebuilt from older guns, but 1941 was the official end of production. Now, they assembled 24,420 M2830s that were considered new production. They also offered a conversion to Civil Guard members to have their older M28s or even M24s updated with the new sights and everything, and they would convert 13,720 older guns, giving us roughly 38,000 M2830 guns. But they would see heavy use. The Winter War was brief, but costly for Finland, more costly for Russia in not just terms of personnel, but also political prestige. And peace would be very brief. By 1941, Finland and Russia were again at war, and what they called the Continuation War, many just kind of lump into World War II because Finland was nominally Germany's ally. But it wasn't so much that the Finns were Nazi collaborators in that sense as they were the enemy of my enemy is my friend. It's complicated. In 1942, the Army and Civil Guards start to kind of get folded in together, especially their inventory. So most of their rifles would go into the same supply depots, and this is when the SA in a box can start to appear, although not all will get it. The Civil Guard would continue to exist until the end of the Continuation War, but then the Russians insisted that it be disbanded because they considered it a right-wing paramilitary organization. In other words, they called them Nazis and said they had to go away. Also, SAKO, that had been building for them, would be sold off. I believe it was just something like the Red Cross. It was kind of unusual. And that meant their guns would end up in the hands of the army because they had already started sharing stockpiles. And from that point, you would get into the Lapland War, where the Finns started fighting Germans instead of Russians. Again, it's a very odd time. Finally, though, in 1945, Finland is at peace again. Now, the M91s and also the M27 and M28, M2830 service lives were actually extended for a couple of years because they did not have enough M39s. However, by this point, 1944-45, we have plenty. And ultimately, they would build roughly 100,000 M39s. Plenty. And really, in most ways, the M39 is the equal to this gun. I think if you're talking about which one's more accurate, it really comes down to individual rifles. They really did take the best features from the M2830 when they were doing the M39. It was pretty influential. But the Army still had some. In the early 50s, 1950-51, they did an inventory count and found that they had 22,000 M2830s. Now, some had been lost to attrition, to combat. Others had simply just been lost. Some had been officially purchased or even privately owned. A couple of thousand had been sold. And others just kind of walked away with their soldiers unofficially. So the numbers are pretty down. They lost just under half. And of those, eventually many would be converted into target guns and eventually sold off as surplus between the 50s and the 70s. And of course, by which time even the M39s are being sold off in favor of the RK-62 assault rifle. These are intriguing because there just aren't that many in the USA. The M39, while an excellent rifle, you can find them in great condition, or battle-worn if you prefer. But the M28 and M2830 have always been a little harder to come by, and they almost always have some honest finish wear and battle damage. And I do understand at first if this just seems like a pretty standard Mosin. By the features and by the looks, it really is. But if you were to handle one, just how nice the bolt is. If I can do it here. This is hard to do one-handed, I will give it that. It is quite smooth, and the trigger is noticeably more predictable and smooth. And feeding is better thanks to the changes to the disconnector, the interrupter, and the mag well itself, where they added the dimples. And I'm told these sights are quite good, although of course it's something I can't really speak to. So yeah, the proof is in the shooting, or at the very least handling of these, because it does show that the Mosin design really can be brought to a different level. And Finland used these very well and helped them kind of develop their arms industry. And again, they had their own loading of the cartridge, known officially as 7.62 by 53. It was a little better when it came to accuracy and tolerances and groupings and all that stuff. Just higher quality, as you'd expect again from Finland. So yeah, not just another Mosin. What do you think? Just picking these up to move them around. The M28 is noticeably lighter. It's not so much that the 30 has a heavier barrel, it's the wood. They went to thicker handguards, even thicker stocks on some models. This is a 1937, so it definitely has the heavier handguard. And they used Arctic birch, which is good, dependable wood, but it's also not near as susceptible to the cold, shrinking, and all that as other woods. It's also worth pointing out, matching and fin matching. On a regular Russian Mosin, you have the barrel/receiver, bolt, floor plate, and butt plate, which kind of serves as the serial for the stock too. Finland's a little different. Again, they didn't make a whole lot of parts brand spanking new. A lot of times they would refurbish and rework existing parts. So fin matching typically just means your barrel/receiver and a bolt. Now the bolt can either be unmarked and numbered, or can be a remarked bolt, commonly the case. And often you won't find a matching number on the floor plate, often not even any number at all, sometimes an old number scrubbed out. So the same goes for the top of the butt plate over here. So a matching finish gun means a force matched bolt to the receiver barrel. If you get that, that's about as good as it gets. Now there are some interesting, weird, rare cases, because these are all hand-assembled, hand-fitted, nearly one-off guns. Not just the M28s, but all these fin Mosins. So the exception that proves the rule stands here. But I just wanted to mention that. Of course, import marks, like any guns. Some came in before '68 thanks to Interarms, and small batches have come in of all the different types over the years through various importers like Century. But yeah, and don't be afraid if you see one that has 60 or 70% or even 40% blue. These guns were used, and it's okay to have honest wear and tear. In fact, I've had some of the mint untouched M39s, and if I'm being honest with you, they're kind of boring. I kind of like the M39s or the M2830s that were at the Winter War and Continuation War. Then again, that's just me. But this seemed like a timely video to do. And again, I was thinking about what bolt actions to cover, so I thought this might be helpful and of interest to some people. As always, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support us, check out the link to the Patreon page. This is Misha. Catch you very soon, next time.